Welcome to Women Who Fights podcast. We empower female fighters to take full agency over their training. Our goal is to celebrate and inspire others with the incredible action women and allies are taking to level the playing field. We talk to experts, uncover prejudice, and champion what's driving our progress.
And today we have Rosi Sexton with us. Rosi is a former mixed martial artist and became the first British female fighter to compete in the UFC in 2013. She's also a Cambridge graduate with a PhD in computer science and now works as an osteopath and is the Green Councillor for Solihull. So, Rosi, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate the fact that you're here speaking to us. You were the first British woman in the MMA. We want to talk about this experience of yours. How did you get into it?
So, I started off by being involved in martial arts. I first got involved in Taekwondo when I was a teenager. As a local club, leaflet through the door, and I wanted to learn some self-defense, basically. So that was my introduction to martial arts in general. Sorry, beg your pardon. From there, I did that for a few years. Then when I went to university, I started to realise, there's other martial arts out there and maybe Taekwondo, doesn't have everything. So I tried a few different martial arts. I did some traditional jiu-jitsu, some judo, various other things. And after I'd been doing that for a few years, I realised that I spent a lot of time learning things, but I wasn't convinced that, if I actually had to put this into practice in a real live situation, if somebody attacked me, whether I would be able to make any of that work. And this was around the time when mixed martial arts was first coming to the UK. It was a very niche sport at the time. A few people were talking about it. It was in some of the martial arts magazines. Most people didn't know anything about it. The media occasionally talk about it as cage fighting. But I looked at that and I thought, that's something I want to have a go at. That's something I want to prove to myself that I can do this. So that's when I started getting involved. I joined a club that was doing that kind of training. I started out in grappling. I did some grappling competitions. That developed into some sort of sport jiu-jitsu competitions. And from there was an opportunity to fight on a full contact mixed martial arts event that was taking place. A promoter was looking for an opponent for one of their female fighters. And this was when there wasn't really any female mixed martial arts happening in the UK at all. So this was an opportunity. I called them up. They'd already got an opponent at that point. So they said, okay, well, we'll give you a shout if anything else comes up. So I went away and I didn't really think any more of it. Then the day before the event, the promoter called me back and said, our opponent's dropped out. Do you want to do it? And I'd been training, but I hadn't been training particularly for this event. I hadn't prepared for it. But again, this was at the time when you didn't know when the next opportunity was going to be coming round. This wasn't, nowadays, if a fight falls through or, you're not ready for something, there'll be something else around the corner. But back then, you didn't know that. So it was a case of saying, well, shall I take it? And in the end, you decided, yeah, let's go for it. So I did that. It was about 24 hours notice. That was quite an experience. That was my first full contact fight of any kind. I got punched in the head quite a lot. We got the fight to the ground. I managed to get an armbar. It was all a bit of a blur at the time. Like I said, it all happened quite quickly, and that was what got me hooked. I thought I went away thinking, yeah, okay, that was all right, but I want to train properly. I want to do this properly. I want to make sure that I'm prepared and go into this knowing what to expect next time. And so it sort of developed from there. And then, I had a few other fights. And it kind of went from one thing to another. I mean, I often say to people these days, I'm half joking, but I said that my entire MMA career was a self-improvement project that got out of hand.
Wow. So what did your training look like when you were at the beginning? I mean, I'm assuming not very many women were, you could, train for properly. How did you manage that?
Yeah, so I mean, most of my training partners, almost all my training partners, in fact, were men at the time, and what I found is once they sort of got to know me and I was a regular part of the club, actually they were all really good. They were really helpful. They saw me, I think, as another athlete that is training, and I think that's the thing. Even back in those days when female fighters were much less common than they are today, I think you'd find that once I got to know people and I was used to training with them, they just treat me like any other person on the mat. I think, the first time you'd roll with somebody, if they weren't used to training with women, sometimes they'd be a little bit awkward or a bit hesitant at first, but quite quickly they'd just get into the things, and before you knew it, you were just the same as anyone else.
And how was sparring done? MMA sparring, was it like full blown in heat on the head, or was it touch and go?
So, I mean, a lot of the sparring you do is fairly light contact. I mean, obviously, even when you're sparring with somebody in your weight class, you don't go the same as you do when you're in a fight. There's light sparring, there's heavier sparring, but you always hold back a bit. And obviously, if you're training with somebody who's significantly bigger than you, who's not in your weight class, then you'll make more allowances for that. I think back in those days, this was still at the time when everyone was trying to figure out what this mixed martial arts thing was all about. People didn't know how to go about training for it in the same way that they do now. So, I remember a time when, if you'd done a bit of striking and a bit of grappling, that was it. You were an MMA fighter, and somehow you put these things together, but you didn't necessarily think too much about, how it all fitted together. It was, well, I can strike, I can grapple, I'm ready to go. And like I say, we look back on that now and you go, blimey, didn't anyone, but again, these were the days when if you knew how to do an armbar from your back in guard, you were something special. People go, oh, wow, what's that? These days it's basic. Every fighter knows how to do that. But the sport's moved on so much. But I think, the way that we've been training, we'd be doing a lot of pad work, a lot of drilling, a lot of, live grappling. Maybe some stand-up striking, but with sort of light contact sparring type thing. So you'd be landing things, but not full out the way you would in a fight. And obviously big gloves and things like that. So and with some of the smaller men that I train with, you get some pretty good rounds. Obviously with the bigger guys, things get much harder. I remember sort of later in my career when I was training at Next Generation in Liverpool, I trained a lot with some of the younger guys, so sort of the teenagers who were coming through, and because they were sort of still growing, they'd be actually a really good sort of size and strength until they got bigger, and then things got got interesting.
Suddenly there'd be a moment where you were like, yeah. Oh no. Wow. And so, these days there's a lot of talk about, or more and more talk about, women tuning more into their body cycles, understanding how to train with your cycle and, so sort of structuring your rest time around that as well. Was that something you took into consideration at all? Because it's quite a new idea.
I think it's something that you'd instinctively sort of pay attention to. Obviously there's days in the month when you'd be training harder. There's sometimes if you're feeling a bit under the weather where you back off a bit, and obviously thinking about, well, this fight is on this date, so how's that going to work out with regard to my monthly cycle, and how's that going to play, and especially if you're making weight as well. So you've got that as an additional consideration. So those are all things that were on my radar. I probably didn't think about it as methodically as people might these days. I think the fact that there's so much more talk about these things now, and it's so much, there's so many more female fighters, and it's discussed quite openly. I think that's a really good thing, because it means that people can, you're thinking about it with other people and learning from everyone else's experience. Whereas I think back when I was doing it, we were all trying to figure these things out on our own. And a lot of the time, I had a couple of women who I train with reasonably regularly, certainly from, maybe in the, in the intermediate years of my career, there were some women who I trained with quite regularly, and sometimes we talk about these things, but it wasn't, most of the women that you'd meet, you were going to end up fighting at some point, because, it doesn't matter what weight class you're in, there's only so many women to fight. So, it was a time when you'd take the fights that you could get, whether that meant going up a weight class, going down a weight class. And that meant there was always that bit of rivalry, I think. If you train with a woman from another club, there'd always be that sense of, okay, well, are we going to end up competing? And, you'd be friendly as well, because when you're in such a small sport, you get to know everyone, and and there's the people you compete against regularly in grappling comps, for example, who you'd see them at every comp, so you kind of build a bit of a relationship, but it was a rivalry as well. So, like I said, now there's so many more female fighters, and you have teams, you have people you train with, and you can almost sort of pick and choose your fights to some extent, which again, obviously that's a good thing. That's progress. I don't.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
Did you have the full support of the people around you when you decided, I'm going to go and compete MMA? How was your family reacting on that?
So I didn't tell my family for quite a long time, actually. But it's a funny story. My parents found out, first of all, because they looked me up on Google, which was perhaps not the best introduction.
Wow.
Just seeing your face, maybe a little bit like bloody.
Oh, wow. How did that turn out?
They were pretty good about it in the end, actually. But yeah. They like I say, it's one of those things. I suppose I didn't want to tell them necessarily, because I thought they might worry. Sure. You know how parents are.
That's fair.
I've told my son, if he ever tries to pull a stunt like that, I'll kill him.
And you can. One of the biggest things about competing or fighting in MMA, well, competing in anything, is the losses as well. So how did you deal with, winning and losing? What was the mentality behind that for you?
That's a good question. My first loss was Gina Carano, which, again, it was a difficult experience, I think, because I think when you've built up a string of wins and you're doing pretty well, people are starting to get to know who you are, and you feel like you're on the verge of, cutting through in terms of some of the international scene, and getting some opportunities and things, and then something like that happens. It is a setback, and I think sort of rebuilding your confidence after something like that is challenging. I think it's always easier going into a fight, and believing yourself when you haven't experienced a big loss. So I think the true test of how you are as a fighter is what happens after that, and how you come back from that. And it's like we've seen with some fighters. Some fighters bounce back from a loss and go on to do really well, and then they have the best part of their career after that. And then there's others who are never quite the same again. And I think that's that's an important part of it. I think the thing with MMA is there's so many ways to win and lose. There's so many different aspects to being a fighter. However good you are, there's always somebody out there who'll have your number. Mm-hmm. We've seen that. No fighter is invulnerable. No fighters are. I'm going to say undefeatable forever. I think if you hang around long enough, sooner or later, somebody will have your number, and that's part of the fight game as well. And I think, for me, it's much easier now looking back on it because I can look back from the perspective of 8 years. 7 years, something like that, since my last fight. And for me now, it's much more about the journey and about what I learned along the way. And the wins and the losses matter much less than than the experience of doing it. I always say to people that the things that make me proudest about the career, being part of that fight for equality, if you like, within mixed martial arts. We were the generation that fought for women to be able to fight mixed martial arts alongside the men on the same shows with the same rules, and we won that fight. I think if you look, mixed martial arts, quite rarely actually in the sporting world, is a sport where women can compete at the top level alongside the men. And I think that's something that I think we should all be incredibly proud of, that we made that happen. And I think, like I say, for me, I look back on that, and that's something that stands out to me. The individual wins and losses, and I've got some that I look back on fondly, and I think, that was a good night, and maybe others that were less of a good night. But I learned something from all of them.
Definitely. Did you do any preparation for your fights for the mentality, or was it just because it sounds a little bit like the Wild West, because everyone was sort of scrabbling to figure out what on earth the MMA was?
I think that's a good term for it. Actually, I think it was very much the Wild West back in those days. I did work with a sports psychologist for a while actually, and I think that was really useful. And I learned a lot from that. That I've sort of taken beyond the sport. There's things that I remember him saying to me that I still look back on now. But yeah, I think the psychology of fighting is huge. That's something that I would definitely recommend every fighter to do. And it's not about whether you've got psychological issues or anything like that. People often think, you only work with a sports psychologist if you've got a problem. But actually, I think it's, in terms of maximising your performance, I think it's something that's useful for everyone. I think looking at that psychology of how you get into the best frame of mind so that you can access your peak performance when you need it. I think that's something that everyone needs to look at. And it's really beneficial because, like I said, there's so much crossover with other fields and other areas of life and everything. I think it's one of those great transferable skills. So I would highly recommend everyone do that.
Definitely. It kind of feels like with extreme sports like MMA, everything is compounded. So everything becomes you get confronted with yourself in a very real way, whereas I think often in life you can kind of get away with do you know what I mean? And then so it sort of makes a lot of sense. It feels like I think it's like the cliche but you learn so much and you can apply so much, and so that what you're saying really resonates with me. It makes a lot of sense that you could then apply that.
There's nowhere to hide when you're in mixed martial arts. You can't bullshit. Because, you can.
You get knocked out.
Bullshit. Sooner or later, you're going to be confronted with that reality, and it doesn't matter, what you say, or it's, the reality is there.
Actions matter.
Yeah. So, I think it is. It's a very, it's a way of, confronting yourself and a lot of your demons and, you know, all of those insecurities and everything. I think again, for me, that was a big part of it. You know, I think it's a bit of a cliche in some ways, but I think it's a truism that a lot of fighters are battling their own demons as much as they are the opponent. When you look at it, you know, spending 12 years as a professional fighter getting paid to punch women in the face and equally getting punched in the face, that's not something that normal, well-adjusted people tend to do, you know. I'm joking, that there's tongue-in-cheek to a degree, but I think there's often something that drives us to do that. You know, as people sort of, as I've moved into other fields, people will look at me when I talk about these things and go, well, why would you do that? You know, why would you sign up for that? It's hard to find a good answer. You know, I had reasons, but it's hard to explain to somebody who doesn't feel that urge, that need to do that, I think. So I think, you know, there is something that maybe drives us to do it. And again, I think, you know, that's something that we could. I've certainly benefited a lot from having spent the time doing that. I think that's made me I'm not going to say a better person, but a different person. I think a more grounded person on the other side of it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You spoke about getting paid to do that, and I wanted to focus a little bit on the pay gap and the exposure of female versus male athletes in MMA. Do you see these becoming more even, and if so, how could this be achieved?
I do see things moving in the right direction. I mean, it's slow progress. The way I put it to people is it's very easy to focus on where we are at the moment, you know, and it's like, how are we ever going to get to a situation where things are equal? But if you look back to the early 2000s when I started and look how far we've come since then, you know, I remember a time when people would talk about female fighters, people would laugh at the idea of women fighting in the UFC. And it's like, oh, that's never. I remember Dana White saying women will never fight in the UFC. He said that, and you know, you go on internet forums and people would be talking about how that, you know, oh, I don't want to watch women fighting. And you look how far we've come to where we are today. You know, nowadays women do compete on those same shows under the same terms as the guys. Now, I'm not pretending that everything's okay, because I know that there is that pay gap, that exposure gap. You know, with the exception of a few high-profile female fighters, and even then, you know, when you compare them to the, you know, their male counterparts, they don't get that same level of exposure and support. But things are way better than they were. And I think we will see things continue to move in the right direction. I mean, mixed martial arts, comparing it to a lot of other women's sport, I think we're ahead in a lot of ways. We've got a lot of advantages compared to some of those other things. And again, you know, that's one of the things that I'm proud of being a part of. But I think, you know, we've still got those battles to fight. And, you know, when you look at not necessarily mixed martial arts, but the related combat sports, things like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and grappling and, you know, your other things, I think, you know, there are those differences in opportunities. And, you know, I mean, again, I'm going back to a time when you turn up at a competition and you wouldn't even know if you had anyone to compete against. Because half the time there was no one there except you. And, you know, I remember fighting in men's divisions because there weren't any other women there. So again, when you look at how far we've come a long way. And, you know, we should keep that in mind, but we've still got a way to go, and we still need to keep that pressure on and keep working.
Definitely. And so one of the things which is interesting is that you were knocked out, right? So having had the experience of being knocked out, and also now you understand it from like a more physiological perspective in terms of like understanding actually what's going on. What does it actually feel like to be knocked out?
It's a really weird experience because at the time it doesn't feel like anything at all. You just wake up and you go, what happened there? And literally no idea what happened. There's just a gap in my experience at that point. So yeah, it's an odd sort of experience, and then you're sort of trying to piece it together, even as people are asking you about it afterwards. So yeah, I mean, looking back and knowing what I know now about, the physiological effect and things like that, it is something that worries me. I think I'll be quite upfront about that. At the same time, again, it's something that is part of the sport. It's part of it's one of the risks you sign up for when you become a fighter. And I think it's the fact that there's the prospect of real physical damage and somebody's actually trying to hurt you. That's one of the things that makes the sport what it is. It keeps it real. And like I say, we can talk about the pros and cons of that, and the fact that there are potentially consequences to a lot of these things. But again, I'm not sure how you take that out of the sport without fundamentally changing what the sport is. So it's one of those things.
How long after being knocked out can you come back and feel okay and feel safe, or is it straight away? Can you spar next?
I mean, in terms of the guidance around concussions and things, there's some pretty established guidance about, you shouldn't be having any kind of contact for like 28 days after a knockout, and even then it depends on symptoms and things like that. So and I think, again, knowing what I know now, that's probably even more important than I realised at the time. Is sort of taking your time when you're coming back from something like that, and because, like I said, there's a physiological process. It's not about heart or character or anything like that. It's not, if you how much you want it or any of those things that people talk about. There's a physiological process, and you've got to give yourself that healing time, just the same as you would with a broken bone or a sprained ligament or something like that. There's that. It takes that time for your body to get back to something like normal.
Yeah. And what is the physiological process of being knocked out?
So, as I understand it, and I think there's still some debate around, exactly what happens, but it's the fact that the brain's shaking inside the skull. So I've heard it said that it's sort of almost in some ways related to a seizure or something like that. So it's not necessarily the impact on the skull itself. It's the fact that rotates the head, which makes the brain shake, and basically when your brain bounces off the back of your skull, which then sparks a cascade of electrical activity in your brain, basically. So that's how I understand it.
That's so interesting.
So you imagine having been knocked out and having a person, because most MMA knockouts is a person on the floor and the other person just keep punching till the referee says stop. So are these then other punches after the actual knockout doing a more severe damage, or is it?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, and that's one of the reasons that referees, a good referee will get in there quite quickly. If the fighter's not responding, the referee should be right there. So if the fighter's still there and is still fighting, they might let it go a bit further, if the fighter's still conscious. But if the fighter's out, the referee should be right in there, and a good referee will be. That's one of the things that they'll look out for, because it's that sort of secondary impact. And as you rightly say, that's one of the things that can be quite damaging. So that is a worry. I mean, in a way, actually, this is one of the reasons that people have sometimes argued that MMA is potentially safer than boxing, because in boxing you can have somebody who's been knocked out and be completely out, but if they can come around and be ready to fight again in 10 seconds, they'll get thrown back in there, and then they could potentially actually be knocked out several times within that fight, as long as they're coming around. So, and that's often where you see that accumulation of damage. Whereas in mixed martial arts, if you're out and you can't defend yourself, that's it, that's over. And actually, I think that's better. Again, both are potentially damaging, but I think the fact that if you can't defend yourself even for a second, that's the fight over.
Yeah. So because I watched a lot of MMA, and when you watch someone who's suddenly stopped defending, what's actually happening? Are they having like a minor seizure and like a sort of similar to being knocked out? Because when they're still awake, but they're just like not able to sort of.
One of a number of things. I mean, like I say, there's times when a fighter is just out and you see they're gone. Proper eyes roll back, and they're not there. Then there are the ones where it's maybe an accumulation of things. And I mean, again, you can be quite confused and sort of not really with it while still just about being conscious. There have been times when I've been, and again, I remember this from my first fight, where everything goes a bit weird around you, and, your brain bounces off the back of your skull. That's when you get those white flashes. And I mean, I remember actually, because I can remember hearing nursery rhymes, and there was a helicopter at one point. And again, because your brain activity does all kinds of crazy things in that moment. And I was there, I was still fighting, I was still sort of with it, but things were quite weird around me. So, that's a possibility as well. And then sometimes you have fighters who they've just had enough. They know that they're not going to win, and they've kind of I'm not going to say given up, because there's quite a negative connotation to that, but they just don't have anything left. And that's something that you sometimes see as well. So it could be any of those.
Yeah, it's so fascinating watching that process happen. It's like nothing else.
When did you become a mother in all of this journey? A very, very interesting journey you had.
So my son was born, he's 16 now, so it was 2005. So I had my first few fights at that point. And I mean, again, this was a time when there wasn't much going on in terms of mixed martial arts. I'd sort of fought most of the people there were to fight in the UK. Getting to the point where you get invited to compete abroad, somebody's prepared to fly you over to the US or something like that. I mean, that's hard. Or it was at that point. There weren't so many big promotions who were putting on female fights. So there weren't that many opportunities around at the time. And it sort of felt like a good time to take a bit of a break in my career. So that was that. My first fight back after Lewis was born he was born in April, and I fought in November, which was on Cage Warriors Night of Champions. And that's still one of my favourite fights to date. That was my, that was one of my proudest nights. I fought Dina van den Hooven, and she'd just come off a couple of big wins. That was a good night. And then that was when I started to get the opportunity to fight abroad. There was the Gina Carano fight, and then Bodog came along, that's probably the first significant promotion to highlight women's mixed martial arts and to have a proper women's division, I think.
Wow. And how did having a son then did it impact your career, MMA career? I mean, just having, as in just something else to think about, having a baby, like at home.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is true with any career. If you've got somebody else to think about, it's hard to put as much focus into that one thing when, you've got somebody else to look after. So I think that's, at the same time, like I say, it was a different time back then. You didn't have full-time professional fighters in the way that you do now, I don't think. Not in women's mixed martial arts anyway. We were all doing other things at the same time. We were all trying to juggle lives and careers and families and other jobs. And fighting was another thing that we did, and obviously we took it seriously, but the money wasn't there, the opportunities weren't there in order for it to be a full-time job as an athlete. And I mean, I think that's one of the opportunities that women do have nowadays, and I mean, I'm really pleased and maybe slightly envious of the fact that they can do that, because, like I said, that wasn't so much an opportunity. I mean, certainly in the early days, towards the end of my career, things were a bit different. When we started having women's fights in the UFC, and women were getting paid more for some of those big matchups, things started to change at that point. But certainly earlier in my career, that was never really an option. But at the same time, I'm really happy that the sport's developed to a point where women are having those opportunities.
Definitely. And did you notice the difference in how your body felt after you had a baby? I imagine there was a difference, but do you remember that being something that was like a hurdle?
I think there's always a process of getting back to normal, or getting back to how things were before. I had a cesarean with Lewis, so there's obviously this sort of post-op recovery as well, and that takes time, so you don't bounce back immediately. But at the same time, looking back, actually, I think it wasn't as big of an obstacle as maybe I might have expected. At the time, it felt like it was it was difficult. Everything does when you're in there. But I think looking back, I think it was sometimes this idea that let me start that again. I think sometimes the obstacles that come along with having children can be overemphasized for women. I think it's a challenge for sure, and I don't want to underplay it. But at the same time, I think it's absolutely very doable. Or certainly,
with the right guidance.
That's it. Everyone's individual experience is different. I was fortunate that I had a very good strength and conditioning coach who I worked with during the pregnancy. So I kept doing some strength training, and actually I gained quite a lot of strength during that period because I was focusing on it. So it didn't take that long to get back to training and back to feeling fit again afterwards. It was, like I say, at the time it felt like it was challenging, but looking back, it all went reasonably smoothly. I think everyone's experience with these things is different, and it's very hard to judge, from one woman to another, because it doesn't always, one person's experience won't always transfer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
You are currently a very, very well-known osteopath, especially in the martial arts world. When did you take up osteopathy, and what led you to that decision? Was it the period of time where you were trying to figure out what else to do with as well as fighting?
Yeah. So I think, I finished my PhD in 2003, and that's when I sort of took a break to focus on martial arts and on competing for a little bit. I wasn't around that time. That was my main focus. Then after Lewis was born, I sort of started thinking, well, what do I want to do with my life? And I didn't fancy spending my life sat behind a desk. Obviously, being a fighter is always temporary. I always tell people nowadays, you'll spend longer as a retired fighter than you do as a fighter. So make sure you think about that. I think, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Something that I became very aware of through both personal experience and the experience of people around me was the whole sports injury thing. And, obviously when you're training, when you're competing, you pick up those injuries, both, the injuries that happen in competition, but also the longer term chronic things, the back pain, the neck pain, the shoulder pain, all of those things. And what I found was that a lot of the people that you'd automatically go to, doctors, physios, didn't necessarily understand the sport well enough to be able to give good advice about getting back to the sport. They could maybe help you get out of pain, but when you ask questions about, well, I've got a fight in 4 weeks, how's that going to go? How do I give that my best shot? Am I able to do that? Is that safe? And you'd ask that sort of thing. And a lot of the time they'd draw a blank because they didn't really understand the sport or the mechanics of the sport or what was involved. And I think, that led me to doing a lot of sort of research myself and trying to read around the subject and understand sports injuries. And eventually I got to the point where I thought, I want to do this properly. This is really interesting. I want to be able to help people do the things that they want to do. And as any fighter will know, there's very little that's worse than being injured and not being able to train and not being able to things. And, that thing that means so much to you in your life, even if you're training for recreationally and for fun and because it's a part of your life, but it's a big part of your life. And not being able to do that because you're injured and not knowing how you can get back to that, that's something that can be really challenging and upsetting. So that was something that I wanted to learn how to help people with. And I think that was my motivation going into it when I started. It's grown a lot since then, and I think I see things. I was very focused on sports injuries and athletes, and I wanted to work with sports people. Nowadays, actually, most of the people I see aren't sports people. Most of the people I see are regular people who just want to get back to doing what they do. And the thing that they all have in common is that they want to get back to the things that are meaningful to them. In some cases that might be playing sport, in some cases it might be going to the gym, in some cases it might be doing yoga. For other people, it's things like, one chap said to me, I just want to be able to play with my grandkids in the park.
Oh.
And, those sort of meaningful activities, however old you are, whatever you do, there will be things that you do with your body that are meaningful to you, that give, that make life what it is. And I think when you can't do that because things hurt, and when you can't, because you're in pain or you've got an injury or you're worried about making things worse, that can have a huge impact on people. So I think, my motivation, in a sense, it's the same thing that I was looking at when I was a fighter, but I broadened it from, just working with people who have that particular interest to people who have lots of other interests as well, but still that common experience of not being able to do what they want to do because of that pain.
Definitely. That sounds like a really lovely motivation, because it like the perspective you have of like it's not about fixing them, it's about getting them to where they find joy. It's a really lovely way of thinking about it.
I think that's actually, unfortunately, really rare in terms of treatment for musculoskeletal injuries, which is the term we give to all of these things. Whether it's joint pain or neck pain or back pain or tendon injuries, muscle injuries. It all comes under that umbrella. But anytime we talk about that, a lot of the time you're going to see a doctor, and too often what people find is that they'll be told something like, oh, well, if that hurts, then stop doing it. You stop training because you're making it worse. You can't run because it makes your knee hurt. And on the one hand, that may temporarily solve the problem with the pain. It may not, actually, because I find that sometimes when people stop doing things get worse rather than better. It does solve that problem. It doesn't solve the wider problem of actually, in order for life to be meaningful, we need to do things. We need to do things with our body, and the physical activity, not only does that have benefits in its own right, for your physical health, for your mental health, but also it's how we interact with the world. It's how people and with each other as well. When I think about the benefits that I've got from doing combat sports and mixed martial arts, some of that was in the physical aspect of it, but a lot of it has been social. It's the community you have, the people you train with, the sense of purpose when you're preparing for something, all of those things, and that relationship with my own body. So it meant much more to me than just the thing itself. So it's very easy for somebody outside of that sport to look at what you're doing and go, oh, well, why don't you just stop doing that? Because it's making your back hurt, so you shouldn't do it. But I think that neglects, is okay, you might have solved one problem, but you've created a whole bunch of other problems. And for me, that never felt like a good answer. That never felt like something that I want to tell people. And I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes there are real challenges. If somebody's got a broken bone, there's no way around that. You're going to have to rest that. You're not going to be fighting next week if you've broken your tibia. But at the same time, I recognise the challenges of that for people, and my focus is always, how can we get you back to doing the things that you love?
Yeah, I think that so comes from the fact that you've had the experience of being a fighter, of being an athlete, and I've got an osteopath who's a dancer and who's done a bit of jiu-jitsu, and she's totally on the same wavelength. She's like, whereas other doctors I've seen have been like, well, the sport clearly isn't very good for you. You should probably stop doing it. And I was like, okay, next. Like, that's not the answer I can work with. And she's like,
people don't listen to that as well. If you tell that to an athlete, all they've heard is that they can't trust you.
Yes. Because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't actually make sense to me that my knee is sore, so I have to stop doing what I'm doing. It's like, no, what do I do to get, like, it doesn't make sense logically that you just stop.
Yeah. How do you get your knee to a place where you can do that?
Exactly.
Rather than just not doing it. So, as I said, I think, I see that there's a clear difference when I look at therapists, whether they're osteopaths or physios or doctors or anything else, who do sport themselves and who understand why people want to be able to do that, and who understand, that whole environment, if you like. And then there's therapists who don't. And I've always said, if you're a therapist who doesn't understand exercise, what are you for?
What are you doing? Absolutely.
But the other thing is, if you just focus on getting people out of pain, that seems so limiting, because it's okay, you can stop doing something because it's painful, but but your world just contracts, and eventually it contracts down to nothing. So you have people who've been not doing things to avoid pain, and firstly they might give up playing sport, and then before you know it, they've stopped cycling to work, and then the next thing is they might stop walking to the shops, and before you know it, they're actually sat on the sofa not doing anything because they're terrified that it's going to hurt. And your world just breaks down to nothing. And a lot of the time, actually, in fact, some of the most satisfying experiences I've had with treating patients have been working with people who've had that. They've ended up doing very little because that they've been trying to avoid pain, and actually sort of working with them to understand how they can make their world bigger again, and how they can get back to some of those activities. And again,
definitely.
We have lots of conversations about the difference between discomfort and pain, and what's okay and what's too much, and how you can work back towards that, and how you can take small steps while staying in control and making sure that you're not pushing yourself too far, but also just trying to nudge the edge of that comfort zone to expand out. And again, I mean, that there's so much crossover there with the benefits I got from mixed martial arts in the first place, where you're looking at maybe taking yourself out of your comfort zone a bit and expanding what you feel able to do. It was in terms of that physical conflict, and addressing something which I was actually, to start with, going back to when I was a kid and as a teenager, that would terrify me, the idea of actually being in a physical fight with somebody. But through martial arts, that was something I was able to address bit by bit until I got to the point where actually I wasn't scared of it, because it was something that I understood how to deal with and I was prepared for. And I think the same is true of so much in life. If you avoid things that are painful or that scare you, your world contracts. I mean, maybe a little bit at first, but the more you do it, the more everything shrinks around you. But if you're able to, maybe with the right kind of guidance and the right kind of support, you can challenge some of those boundaries just a little bit in a way that's that feels safe and that feels, okay to you. You can get back to being able to do some of those bigger things that might have been too much at first.
Definitely. I mean, in my experience of my myriad of injuries, I've had so many. I've found that so often it's the combination of having like an osteopath or someone and the right movement. Yeah. So I often feel like if you're told to just stop moving, then it's like you just stagnate. But if I move in the right way, I do the right exercises, or I do this thing in a controlled way, but I'm still moving, I'm still exercising, I'm still being, working. Then it heals and it sustains itself. Whereas if you just see an osteopath, when I was young, I hit my back when I was 9. I hit my back on like a flying fox. I slipped, and I went to an osteopath and it was slightly out.
Yes.
So I had to go to an osteopath, and he clipped me back in, and then every month I'd get more pain, and he had to go and click me back in, and he was like, "This is ridiculous. You have to maintain." So he made me do yoga. So I started yoga when I was a kid because it was like I had to, and it was like this first like, that your body's actually something that you need to work on and keep together, and actually you can't. It needs help, and that the support and the right exercises and all of the right stuff to go along with it.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that I always tell people. My job as an osteopath is to keep people out of my clinic. I don't want people to have to come back every few weeks because they've hurt something again. I want to get them to the point where they can manage it and give them the tools and almost the life skills in order to stay out of pain. And then I'm here when they need something. So rather than, my job is not to just rub people and clip their backs. My job is to solve problems. And, the more I can get people to manage things for themselves and to help themselves and give, them the right exercises and the right management strategies so that they can stay out of pain. That's what I get a buzz out of doing. me, what success looks like is when I don't see somebody for several years and I might bump into them in the street and they go, my back's been great ever since I saw you. And if it starts to get niggly, I just do those exercises and it's been absolutely fine. And that's success. That's where I want to be. And I mean, something that one of my tutors told me in college, which stayed with me, and I always say this to other people, is that if you try and put yourself out of work, you'll never succeed. If you try and get yourself to a point where people don't have to come and see you, you'll always be busy as an osteopath. And,
on that,
that's absolutely true.
On that, I know this is a little bit general, but how could athletes, and especially female athletes, prolong the longevity of their athletic career? What are the vital do's and don'ts when they train so that they don't have to come and see you?
So there's a short answer and there's a long answer. The short answer is strength training. And I think particularly for female athletes, it's so important. Alongside whatever else you're doing some strength training. It doesn't necessarily need to be a lot. It doesn't necessarily need to take over your training, but having some strength training in there really, really helps. And it helps with everything. For combat athletes, it's not just about making you stronger so that you dominate. It's not about making your performance better, although it will do that as well. But it's also about making you more resilient. Because if you're strength training, you're improving your muscle strength, but it also strengthens your connective tissues, your tendons, your ligaments, your bones, all of those things, all of which makes it less likely that you're going to have those injuries in the first place. So if there's one thing I tell people, get a good strength training program and sort of put that in as part of your training plan. And again, sort of focusing around big sort of multi-joint movements, things like your squats, your deadlifts, chin-ups, bench press, maybe lunges, your big exercises like that, And I think having that program, spend a bit of time with a really good strength and conditioning coach to get an understanding of how to do that, and that will pay off many, many, many times over. I think that one of the things that I noticed is the difference it made when I started doing proper strength training. I had so many fewer injuries. It was, like I say, night and day. So, I say that to everyone, but I think particularly for women in the sport, and I think it particularly applies to women. One, because we tend to train with people who are bigger than us, and who have more testosterone than us. And as a result, I think having that extra resilience makes a difference. But also because we don't naturally gain muscle as easily as some of the guys do. So I think for men, I still think strength training is important for men. But if you're a guy and you just do grappling, you just do mixed martial arts, you'll still get quite a lot of muscle gain and strength benefits just from doing that. I think with women, it's harder to get that same level of improvement just from doing your martial arts work. So I think doing the extra bit of strength training will correspondingly make more difference. And that's why I think that's so important. I think, in terms of other things that women can do, and that is so far, the number one thing. It absolutely dwarfs everything else that you might think about doing. So the other things are very much sort of secondary to that. I think, again, things like getting having a good diet that's sustainable. So, what you see with a lot of female athletes is, with a lot of fighters generally, you have that where you crash diet to lose weight to get to a weight class, and then you put it all back on again, and you repeat, rinse and repeat. And I think that's problematic, again, particularly problematic for female athletes. So I think trying to get to a sustainable where you're, you've got a healthy routine, a healthy diet that you can maintain. I think that's important. Sleep, none of us get enough of it, or most of us don't anyway. And I think that's massively underrated in terms of both performance and recovery. People often say, well, what's the best thing I can do for my recovery? Very often my answer is sleep more.
Okay,
that makes sense.
Again, people spend lots of time, thinking about, the esoteric stuff you could do is, will this vibration platform help my recovery? Not as much as getting an extra hour of sleep a night. So there's that. There's, again, planning your training and periodizing your training well, so that you're getting, for example, things like alternating hard days and easy days, so that you're not hitting that overtraining point, especially when you've got a fight coming up. Making sure that you've got a good training plan. Overtraining is absolutely endemic in mixed martial arts. We all overtrain to some extent, mostly because you've got so many different areas to cover. You've got your striking, your grappling, your wrestling, your pad work, your S&C. By the time you've done a bit of everything, you've probably ended up going over what is optimal in terms of just that, what your body can recover from. So trying to plan your training in such a way that you do get those rest periods, that's quite important as well. Making sure that you've got a good cardio base. I know that sort of high intensity training, interval training became very trendy, and for a while everyone was focusing just on that and saying, oh, you don't need to do steady state cardio, just do intervals, it'll be fine. And it's true that you can peak very quickly just by focusing on the high intensity stuff. But actually, in terms of recovery and in terms of your long-term, growth, I think having that sort of steady state work is really important, recovery cardio almost. So I think that's important to have in there. And I think that was underestimated for quite a while. I always found that, when I was putting some of that more steady state work in, that really helped with everything else. And it just made me feel physically fresher. So that's good. So there's a few other things that I would encourage people to focus on.
Thank you for that.
Amazing. That's really, really, I think, it's really nice. It's really good to know that like strength training is so far at the top. Like that's a really good thing to be able to focus on, I think. Have you noticed a difference between men and women in the way that they get injured? Have you had to?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there is a lot of similarities and some differences. I think it tends to be more related to body type and how you fight, what you do. There are some general differences. I mean, women tend to be more flexible and they tend to have less power. But obviously within men and within women, there will be those individual differences as well. And I think that what I tend to find is when I'm treating people who are either end of the flexibility scale, so people who are very stiff or who are very flexible, both tend to get more problems. People who are in the middle, or who are more average, tend to get fewer problems. And the problems that people who are very stiff tend to get are a little bit different from the problems that people who are very flexible tend to get. With people who are stiffer, I will focus on mobility work, which isn't necessarily the same thing as static stretching. And with people who are more flexible, I will focus even more on strength work. I find that having the strength to stabilise your joints through that full range of movement is so important, and that's one of the key predictors of injury, particularly in my more mobile folk.
Does that affect their flexibility, though?
Sometimes it does, not necessarily. One of the things that I will look at, for example, if somebody's very flexible and wants to keep that flexibility, what we'll look at is the strength through that full range of joint movement. So we'll look at doing, for example, lots of isometrics and maybe some eccentric work through the end range of that joint movement. And what I find is that by doing that, you can keep the range, but also make sure that towards that end range, you've got more strength. Because what often happens is when you've got a joint that's got more range, you tend to find that everything is weaker towards that end range. Both because the muscles are more compromised. It's if you're trying to contract a muscle from a lengthened position, it's harder to do. So specifically working, we can specifically strengthen the muscle in particular positions, and this is one area where isometrics can be really, really useful, because you can highlight those end range positions and those places where people are more likely to get into problems. So I look at this for people with hypermobile elbows, for example. This is something that I see quite a lot, because often when you go past that 180 degree position, when you go to that lockout, that's where you'll see that injury, because you haven't got as much strength there to stabilize the joint and to protect that joint. That's where people are maybe a bit more likely to get injured. So working the strength in that range. So I'll do things like I'll get people doing slow eccentrics, maybe with chins or with bicep curls, but doing very slow lowering through that end range. And we often find that, sometimes people will lose a little bit of range, and sometimes that's not a problem, actually. Sometimes that, particularly, like I say, with elbows, actually that can sometimes be quite a good thing. But what it does tend to mean is that people are much less likely to get injured when they end up there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
So, yeah, go on, Shanti.
Oh, okay. Well, so we've spoken a lot about your osteopathy and your athletic career, but you're also a politician.
Yes.
You're a councillor. You're a Green Party councillor. How did you get there, and what's that side of your?
So again, this was another accidental journey. I joined the Green Party back in 2015, around the time of the general election. I wasn't very active. I didn't really do a lot, but I thought, it was the party that best represented sort of my political views. I moved to Solihull sort of not long after that, in fact, and again, I had no intention of sort of getting involved in local politics, but the local Solihull Green Party came and hunted us down and sort of introduced themselves and said hello. And in fact, it was my partner who got more involved than I did at first. And sort of one thing developed into another. He ended up sort of putting himself forward to stand as a candidate in the elections. I thought, okay, fine. And then he came home from a meeting one day and said, they're still short of a candidate for one of our target wards. So, we need somebody who's going to stand the seat, and we think we can win it, but we haven't got somebody to put there. And I kind of thought about it for a bit. I said, and I always claimed that I had my arm twisted, but they didn't have to try very hard, to be fair. And so I ended up saying yes to that. So we had the election campaign. Like I said, the local Green Party here are very effective. They've already got quite a lot of councillors, and they're good at winning elections. So it was a question of, right, this is what we're going to do. Go and do it. And before I knew it, I found myself as a newly elected councillor. So it's very much a case of sort of being dropped in at the deep end, really. It was like, here's your councillor badge, off you go.
Wow.
And I think one of the things with the roles, it to some extent, it is what you make it. There's lots of different things that you can focus on as a counsellor. There's, there are various aspects to it that we all do. There's the what they call casework, which is where residents of our area who we represent bring us problems. And so, maybe they're having a problem with the council because the bins aren't being emptied in a particular area, or they've got one of the trees has fallen over, or there's a pothole that needs fixing, or the bins aren't being collected properly, or whatever it is. So here's a problem, can you deal with it? And again, we've got the ability to contact the council officers and the people who actually work and say, right, can you sort this out, please? And then there's also the committees, which are where we look at areas of policy for how services are being delivered locally, for example, or how the council should handle particular kinds of issues. And one of the things that I've tended to concentrate on some of the health and adult social care services, partly because that's sort of an interest I had through my day job. It's something that I feel very strongly about. So that's something that I've ended up, I've been on a lot of those committees, and also sort of becoming the local spokesperson for health and adult social care. So it's sort of going from dealing with individual health on a one-to-one basis to looking at health policy that affects a borough of 250,000 people, which is
wow.
And again, there's a lot of crossover in a way, because when I talk to people individually, and you notice sort of some of the things that are causing them problems and that are causing them to have those problems, sometimes it comes down to things like government policy and their ability to access other services. If somebody is struggling because for example, I have people who come and see me who have back pain, who can't afford, they have to lift as part of their job. Maybe they're a social care worker or something like that, and they can't afford to take time off because they're on a 0 hours contract, and they don't get sick pay. And that's one of the, so you see how, the individual problems people have tie in with some of the wider social issues. And then you start thinking, well, actually, in order to address this properly, we need to look at those wider issues. Hold on a sec while I just make sure my laptop is plugged in. It's there we go. Battery. So we have to look at some of those wider social issues in order to prevent those problems arising in the first place. So for me, it was a fairly natural progression from, I went from mixed martial arts to being an osteopath, to realising that some of those individual problems are actually symptoms of a wider systemic issues, and then sort of trying to think, well, how can we address those?
Wow.
And again, it's another very interesting and sometimes very frustrating set of challenges.
Well, all we see is a person who doesn't like complacency, because you constantly keep moving forward and challenge yourself, which is
and solving problems that you see.
I think solving problems is a key there, because I think for me, again, it's I can't remember who said it to me, but it's really good for it. Is that don't think about what you want to do, think about the kind of problems you want to solve, because Absolutely. If you think about the problems you see out in the world and what you want to fix, there will always be work to do. There's work out there.
Yeah.
It's I suppose what I've always looked at is, well, this needs to be better, and I don't, and how can we make it better? And then by the time you've taken the time to understand the problem and understand why it's not always a simple thing to fix, but then you're in a position to actually try and make a difference and say, okay, well, I understand the challenges here. I mean, at the moment, I'm frantically trying to get my head around health policy and some of the healthcare reform that's being proposed. Again, sort of going on from politics, I found myself getting involved with some of the local government association policy boards, because the local government association is the group that represents all of local government at council level, and they get consulted on a lot of government policy that is being developed in Westminster, and that's discussed on some of these policy boards. So that's my, something that I'm now starting to get involved in is, right, well, how can we feed back in terms of that policy in order to make a difference to what's being decided, to make a difference at that higher level. And again, it's sort of thinking about, right, well, if I've got 3 minutes to talk to somebody in government and to give them some feedback, which may affect how they think about this, which might affect, what that policy ends up being, what am I going to say? And wow. Again, it's exciting and it's challenging.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Speaking about making a change, what could the barriers be for women in politics, and how could we get more women in politics?
I think, one of there are a number of challenges. One is sort of obviously avert sexism, which unfortunately there still is plenty of that about. There is plenty of people who, sometimes actually very consciously, just don't see women as strong, competent leaders in the way that they assume men will be. So that's still a problem. I think unconscious bias is an even bigger problem. The people who will say, oh yeah, I'm all for women's equality, but they will make assumptions about the competence of women in a way that they don't for men. And that, they'll look at a woman and a man in the same roles and they will judge them according to different criteria. And that's something that a lot of people, and I'll even go as far as to say a lot of us, do without thinking about it. And I think unless we're challenging some of those unconscious biases, it's a very easy trap to fall into. And I think even people who sort of, I like to think that I'm, very much in favour of equality and very much in favour of, equal opportunities. But I will still occasionally catch myself making assumptions that I shouldn't make. But the important thing is that I catch myself doing it, and I can say, no, that's a bad assumption. And I think that's the thing. We all need to be on our guard for that, because it's something very easy to do. We live in a culture where there are still those sexist assumptions, those sexist, the way we judge men and the way we judge women as a culture is different. And it's something that's very easy to internalise unless we're looking out for it. And again, I think it's something that, as women, we're socialised differently compared to our male counterparts. We're taught to behave differently. I think there is still the idea that, it's that, if a woman puts herself forward, she's maybe being aggressive, whereas a man in doing the exact same thing wouldn't be accused of behaviour. That would be completely normal behaviour. And I think that's something that, again, we have to look out for in, when we're maybe more reluctant to put ourselves forward for some of those roles, and sort of, maybe judge ourselves harshly and sort of say, oh, well, I don't have the skills, I don't have the abilities to do that. And sort of say, well, actually, how much of that is the reality? If I compare myself to the other candidates for that, actually, I'm perfectly well qualified for it. But as women, we've again, I'm generalising. This isn't universally the case, but a lot of the time, society does encourage us not to put ourselves forward. I think it's something that actually, having spent a decade and a bit more in the mixed martial arts world, that is a very good way of learning to counter that.
Okay.
I noticed that, for example, the Conservative group, who, they are opposition on Solihull Council. I can't. Somebody told me that apparently said that I'm, quote, a bit too aggressive, quote unquote. I heard that, and my first reaction was, okay, well, I'm a woman with an opinion. Of course, they're going to think I'm a bit too aggressive. But again, had I been, 15 years younger, 20 years younger, before I went into mixed martial arts, that might have been something that I'd take to heart.
I think it's definitely, I've started doing some striking recently, and one of my, it's so out of my comfort zone. And I think, I don't know if who else has this, but I find it incredibly difficult to get in someone's face because it feels aggressive. And I often feel like I transfer that now to more like in life. I'm like, wow, like getting comfortable with actually being confrontational, or what we perceive as confrontational, rather than, because often it's not actually, if you compare yourself to this other person, this other guy or someone who's done it, and you're like, well, I'm not being more than them. It's just that this feels so taboo, or it feels so different to what I should be doing.
Sometimes I'll do, and I will worry that I'm being too confrontational sometimes. And then I'll look at it and I go, no, actually that was, or I'll run it past somebody else and say, was that okay? And they go, yeah, it's fine. What are you worried about? But I completely get that. And I still have that sort of sense of, am I being too confrontational here? Like I say, I think, a decade of mixed martial arts has helped me to worry about that less. I mean, again, my reaction to you being too aggressive is, you've not seen me being aggressive.
Google it. No.
I'll send you a video. You can have a...
aggressive. This isn't it.
I really hope that comes up one day.
Would a man doing the exact same thing be being accused of being too aggressive? Yeah, probably not.
Guys, but I feel like men rarely get accused of that in like the social sort of sphere. Do you know what I mean?
At the same time, I think because of that socialisation, in a way, that actually gives women some strengths that maybe men don't get because of the way that they're socialised.
Oh yeah, toxic masculinity works both ways.
Yeah. And actually, I think being a bit more considerate and understanding of people's feelings when you're having a conversation or a difficult conversation, actually that can be a good thing. Sometimes we're told that, this is a bad thing because women need to be more assertive like men. So actually, sometimes I think men need to behave a bit more like women. I think, sometimes being considerate of that person's feelings when you're having a conversation with them is not a bad thing. That's not a weakness. So I think it works both ways.
Definitely.
And I think it actually allows us to maybe have more influence in a different way. I think there's, being very aggressive, there's a time and a place for that, don't get me wrong, and I think it's good to be able to do that. But actually, sometimes you'll have better results by having a more conciliatory conversation with somebody, and looking for kind of win-win options. How can we make this? How can we look at this in a way where we get a good outcome for everyone? And again, I think that's something that we are more conditioned to doing because of that, the way that women are socialised compared to the way that men are socialised. I don't think it's anything to do with natural, at least whether there is a natural difference or not. I think the jury's still out on, because we don't have a society without gender roles in order to compare with. If we did,
don't have a.
I mean, there may be a natural difference. I've no idea. But like I say, we're not at a place where we can answer that question, I think, is, the way that girls are treated growing up is so different from the way boys are treated growing up, that a lot of difference, I think, comes down to that.
To nurture.
Yeah. And like I say, I think, we shouldn't necessarily assume that women need to be more like men all the time, because I think, the converse is often true. Like I say, I think, there are times when I will deliberately be more conciliatory and less aggressive, not because I think I feel like I should as a woman, and because I'm afraid of being aggressive, just because I think it's the best way to get the outcomes that I'm looking for. So I think being able to consciously do either one or the other is what we're looking for. It's not replicating the way that men behave. It's being able to look at that whole spectrum of different behaviours and say, right, I can choose where on that I want to be. Again, I think that's one of the things that mixed martial arts has helped me with, is being able to consciously say, actually, I'm quite happy to be aggressive. It's not a problem. I may not want to be, but that's a choice. It's not because I can't.
Definitely. Thank you. That's given, like, you're very good at explaining that kind of experience, because I think it's very shared that, I know I've had a lot of times in my life where I questioned my own, how I've appeared to be, and then had to check, and it's actually like, it's fine. But I think our last question, which is the one we ask everyone, and it's, what are you fighting for? And this can be broad, small, however you want to interpret it.
That's a good question. I think, again, this risks sounding a little bit cliched and trite, but I think at this stage, I like to think that I can leave the world a slightly better place than I found it. And I think changing the world is hard. The more you get involved in things like politics, the more it's like no one person can do that on their own. And I think all any of us can do is make our corner of the planet a little bit better than it was when we found it, and the people around us a little bit better off than they were when we found them. And I think that's the way I tend to think of things these days, and it can be on quite a small scale. When I work in clinic, one of the things that gives me the most buzz and I get the most out of is when somebody walks away and that you've made a real positive difference to that person's life. It's like, because of the work that I've done, they're able to go back to doing the things they love. They're able to have a better quality of life, and that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I think, like I say, I've started to look at that on a broader scale, and it's like, by looking at policy and by looking at how things, maybe those services are delivered across a wider area, can we look at making things better for lots of people rather than just that one person? But I think the principle is the same. It's you look at the things that I can control and see how can I make things a bit better. Those incremental improvements. There's always going to be problems. There's always going to be things that are wrong with the world. But it's taking that one particular challenge. How can I make things a bit better?
Marvellous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
Very, very insightful interview. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent.
You're full of wisdom.